Students, and welcome to Political Science 1513.W1, American Federal Government Online. Once again, I am your instructor, Alford, and today we're going to begin our discussion of the executive branch. Towards that end, we have 6 major learning objectives, and we'll start by reading each of them off of the screen for those of you who aren't able to do so on your own. Learning objective number 1, describe the function and organization of the executive branch. Learning objective number 2, distinguish between and describe the formal and informal powers of the president and explain how they have developed or changed over time. Learning objective number 3, discuss the 5 hats worn by the modern president, or, in other words, explain the 5 major roles that the President of the United States fulfills in our government today. Learning objective number 4, explain the various threats to the president's power and the importance of the presidential imperative in mediating the severity of these threats. Learning objective number 5, explain what the bureaucracy is, how it has changed over time, and why it might be problematic. Learning objective number 6, identify the 3 major functions of the bureaucracy and explain the meaning of some key concepts in this process, including administrative law and administrative adjudication. To start with learning objective number 1, let's look at the core function that defines the executive branch. Remember from prior lecture that the legislative branch is that organ of federal government constitutionally charged with legislating or creating the laws. The judicial branch is the portion of our federal government constitutionally charged with adjudicating or helping to interpret and resolve disputes about the application of the law to particular cases in controversy. While the executive branch is the organ of federal government constitutionally charged with the execution and enforcement of the laws, or in other words, the executive branch is the administrative branch, the portion of the federal government responsible for administrating our country on a day-to-day basis. Now, you might have been told in the past that the executive branch is the president, but that's not entirely accurate. The president is just one part of the executive branch, arguably the most important part, certainly the chief of the executive branch, but nevertheless, but one cog in a much larger machine. So let's talk for just a moment about how the executive branch is organized and how it actually operates. Towards this end, understand that there are 2 primary components that together constitute the executive branch. The first primary component of the executive branch is the presidency. And the presidency is going to be made up of the President of the United States, the Vice President, the Executive Office of the Presidency, the White House Office, the Cabinet, and the Kitchen Cabinet. That's 2 groups of advisors, 2 groups of staffers, and 2 presidential persons, the president and vice president. But in addition to the presidency, we also have the executive bureaucracy. And to understand the executive bureaucracy, we first need to know what a bureaucracy is. So a bureaucracy might be defined as, and I quote, an organization that is structured hierarchically to carry out specific functions, a complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, principles of government, and other concepts employed by a large-scale institution to coordinate the work of their personnel and achieve some core function. In the case of the executive bureaucracy, the core function is the administration of our country. In other words, the bureaucracy is an organization structured hierarchically to carry out the day-to-day administration of our government. And because this task of governing a country the size of the United States is so complicated and difficult, the bureaucracy is also somewhat complex, and it is divided into a variety of offices and sub-offices, each of which has its own set of tasks, employees, personnel, rules, and principles that it's going to follow in order to fulfill some small part of the broader administrative function. To understand how the bureaucracy is organized, you need to understand that it is broken first and foremost into 15 cabinet departments. A cabinet department is one of the 15 major departments of the executive bureaucracy that reports directly to the president and encompasses a large number of subsidiary agencies. These subsidiary agencies, in turn, are federal agencies that operate inside the umbrella of a broader cabinet department. So, for example, The bureaucracy as a whole is there to help administrate our country on a day-to-day basis. It is a body of some 2.7 million government employees who provide the machinery of governance, who put boots on the ground and carry out policies created by Congress on the floor level. However, this is then going to be divided into 15 departments, including the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Interior, the Department of Justice, and many others. If you would like a comprehensive list of the different departments, you are referred to Table 11-1 on page 256 of your textbook. But we're going to focus for just a moment on the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department, like all departments, is going to report directly to the President, and like all departments, it's also going to handle a very broad issue area. So the principal function of the Treasury Department is to handle our finances. It handles the financial administration of our country, but that involves a large number of smaller tasks that have to be completed. So, for example, a part of handling our finances is paying all of the bills. Another part is borrowing money and collecting taxes, whereas another part is minting coins, and another part is printing paper currency, and another part is supervising any national banks that we might deign to create or maintain. So there's a lot that goes into the broad function of the Treasury Department, which will combine with the broad functions of these other 15 or these 14 other departments in order to ultimately culminate in total administration. But since the departments handle such broad issue areas, they are subdivided into smaller agencies. Within the Treasury, we have the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and it will handle one small part of the Treasury Department's broader mission of financial administration. In particular, the IRS is responsible for tax collection. On the other hand, within the Treasury Department, we also have the U.S. Mint, which is responsible for minting coins and printing paper currency. So again, within each of the broader departments, we're going to have a number of subsidiary agencies that are slightly more specialized in their general task, but that report to the department as a whole. We will also find that in addition to the cabinet departments and all of their subsidiary agencies, you have a few independent agencies that are going to operate outside of a particular cabinet and yet that are nevertheless a part of the executive bureaucracy. We'll elaborate on that later in this lecture. But for now, let's start to focus in on the presidency as the first of the two major components of the United States executive branch. Now, one big theme that I want you to focus on throughout this lecture is quite simply this. The President of the United States rarely acts alone. Even within the presidency, he is dependent upon two groups of advisors and two groups of staffers. The two groups of advisors that the President relies on to keep him in the know are the Cabinet and the Kitchen Cabinet. The Cabinet is a formal panel of advisors made up of the Vice President and the 15 heads of those cabinet departments we discussed mere moments ago. So, for example, we talked about the Treasury Department. Well, the Treasury Department is headed by the Secretary of Treasury. The Secretary of Treasury is nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. And once nominated, the Secretary of Treasury is going to sit on the President's board. And on this board, this cabinet, the department's secretary is responsible for keeping the president knowledgeable about all of the problems facing our country's finances and about all of the best possible solutions to these problems. Without their data, information, personnel, and expert advice, the president would have no idea how to handle the debts in our country, minting, coining, and printing cash, so on and so forth. So the President of the United States, even within the presidency, is dependent on the advisors who sit in his cabinet in order to actually get anything done, because without them, he won't know what problems we need him to solve or what solutions are most likely to work. In addition to this formal panel of advisors, however, the president also has a kitchen cabinet, which is an informal group of personal friends and relations that the president trusts to have his best interest at heart and to exercise sound judgment in recommending policies or directions to take the country in. Now, the kitchen cabinet sounds a little hokey, and that's because it is. These individuals are not necessarily government employees, and they, generally speaking, don't have any formal position, power, or authority. But because they are trusted by the president and because they have the president's ear on a regular basis, they are nevertheless able to play a very substantial role in shaping political outcomes and policies in our country. In addition to these two groups of advisors, however, the presidency also encompasses two groups of staffers, and these are going to be the White House office, which you can think of as the president's political or PR team, and the executive office of the presidency, the EOP, which you can think of as the president's administrative team. The White House office is usually made up of people who have some connections to influential families and or who have worked on the president's campaign team. And their job is to basically help make sure that the president's political interests are being satisfied. They want to make sure that the president maintains popularity and public support so that it is easier for him to focus on running our country rather than running for re-election, and so that he has an easier time getting his proposed policies passed through Congress. In addition to this political team, the White House office, we also have that administrative team, the EOP. And this is a staff of personnel who were originally created by the presidency of FDR and who continue to serve a simple function. They help to coordinate the executive branch's offers and efforts with those of the bureaucracy and the legislative branch of government. So if the President of the United States needs to communicate with the bureaucracy or with some other branch of our federal government, he is going to rely on the EOP to make that happen. Of course, the presidency also includes the president himself and the vice president, but we're not going to talk too much about the vice president. The vice president of the United States honestly doesn't have that much power. He will ultimately serve as the president until the next election if a sitting president becomes incapacitated temporarily, or because he's died while in office, or because he has been kicked out of office, or because he's decided to retire early. But other than that, he casts tie-breaking votes during a tie in the Senate, and he's a very important figure for publicity purposes, but doesn't have many formal functions in the government. So let's focus on the president, his powers, and how they have changed over time. The first thing I want you to understand is that the President of the United States was originally intended to be relatively weak, at least when we're talking about domestic affairs. As a result of this, the expressed or formal powers of the president are very, very limited. An expressed or formal power is a power given to the president explicitly by the law. And there are two types of expressed power. The most obvious type of expressed presidential power is the constitutional power, which is a power of the president granted directly through explicit reference in the Constitution. For example, the Constitution explicitly stipulates that the President of the United States shall nominate any justices who serve on the Supreme Court. Therefore, we can say that the President has a constitutional power to nominate justices. But in addition to the Constitution, the President has gained some extra expressed powers over time through acts of Congress. These powers granted to the President not by the Constitution but by an act of Congress are sometimes called statutory powers. A really good example of a statutory power is the executive order. Now, we'll talk more about executive orders later on, but I do want you to know that there is nothing in the Constitution which authorizes the president to actually release an executive order. That was a power given to the president by Congress some decades ago, and it's one that they've probably regretted ever since. Nevertheless, what we're going to find is that even with the statutory expansion of the president's original constitutional authorities, presidential powers are very limited in the formal sense. So the president is going to get most of his modern power not from his expressed constitutional or statutory authorities, but through what we call informal or inherent powers. Informal or inherent powers are practical powers never explicitly written into the law, which don't require any kind of an official action, but which nevertheless derive from the prestige and resources of being president, and which nevertheless allow the president to exercise a great deal of influence over our country, its laws, and the world. A really great example of an informal power of the president is the power of the president to mobilize the people by speaking directly to them. Donald Trump, for example, has really helped to control the narrative and shape which issues we focus on, talk about, or try to solve in this country simply by sending out tweets. Now, there's nothing in statutory law or in the Constitution which authorizes the president to send out tweets as a mechanism of social mobilization. But because he's the president, people pay attention to him, and that means that, practically speaking, it's very easy for him to exert influence in this way. That ability to exert mass influence simply by sending out a tweet is something inherent to the prestige, visibility, and resources of being the President of the United States. And what we're going to find is that the rapid expansion of the president's informal powers with technological changes and social changes is really going to help explain how the president has gone from being what people sometimes pejoratively call the clerk-in-chief, a glorified secretary, to the most powerful person in the free world today. So now that we know the different powers of the president, formal and informal, and how they have changed over time, I want you to understand that the presidents of the United States have come to fulfill 5 major functions, or, in other words, to wear 5 distinct hats. They act in 5 different ways, serving 5 different functions for our government and the administration of our country. The first of the president's 5 hats is what we call the head of state. And the president fulfills this role by serving as a ceremonial figurehead of government. This is the most informal and least explicitly constitutional role of the president, and it's the most symbolic. So the president serves as the Secretary of State when he acts like a symbolic head or standing head of government and gives the people a sense of leadership, especially in a time of crisis. When the president helps to foster an American identity, say by throwing the first pitch of a baseball season, he is acting as our head of state. When he addresses the nation after a tragedy or during a time of crisis, he is acting as the head of state. Anytime the president speaks directly to the American people as their leader, he is acting as the head of state. But this involves very little formal activity and a great deal of social display and general ceremonial activities that are culturally relevant but don't require any kind of official or legal action be taken. So this is the most symbolic and informal of the president's 5 roles. But the president is not just the standing head or head of state, he's also the acting head or chief executive. And we say that the president is wearing his chief executive hat, that he is acting as a chief executive any time that he uses his position as the head of the executive branch of our government to help administrate our country by enforcing and executing the laws. And there are a number of ways that he can go about doing this, the most obvious of which is to issue an executive order. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding, so one thing that definitely needs to be in your notes is quite simply this. Executive orders do not create new laws. Executive orders do not create new laws, but they can be very influential because they can A, authorize the appropriate agents in government to enforce existing laws, or B, provide instructions to the relevant government decision makers about how they should implement the laws. And the instructions that the president provides may not create an entirely new policy, but they can dramatically change how a policy is being executed. In addition to issuing executive orders, the president can act as chief executive by nominating cabinet members, judges, and justices, grants of pardon, or by giving grants of amnesty. He can also dispatch troops to enforce law and order in the domestic domain. However, I don't want to confuse students. The third hat that the president wears in our government is the place where he is at his most powerful, and this is when he serves as our commander-in-chief. Generally speaking, if the president is mobilizing troops, he is not acting as chief executive, but commander-in-chief. The only exception is that if he is mobilizing troops domestically for the purpose of maintaining law and order by enforcing federal laws on American citizens, that's the chief executive. But any other time he mobilizes troops for a purpose related to national security, war, or foreign policy, he's acting as the commander-in-chief. The President of the United States is the supreme commander of the military forces of our country and of the state National Guard units when they are called into federal service. The President can act as the commander-in-chief by sending troops abroad or by defending our country against an active aggression by some foreign attacker. The President of the United States has a lot of unilateral authority in this area, so even though he rarely acts alone, if he is going to act alone, it's when he's serving as our commander-in-chief. There have been some attempts to limit this, like the War Powers Act of 1973, which stipulates that if a president dispatches troops to foreign soil, he has 90 days to get Congress to declare war or withdraw those troops. But this act has never really been taken to court, and it's never really been invoked by Congress. It has been defied at least once under the presidency of Barack Obama, but by and large, most presidents have voluntarily complied with this congressional policy, even though it probably wouldn't be upheld were it to be taken to a court of law, because again, the Constitution says that the president is the supreme commander of our armed forces, not Congress, and therefore he doesn't really need their permission, and nobody has really tried to force the War Powers Act on an involuntary president, because they basically know that the courts are going to side with the president in that fight, and Congress doesn't want to look foolish. In addition to acting in these capacities, the president serves as our chief diplomat when he acts as a symbol of American leadership abroad, or when he is communicating with foreign countries, leaders, or peoples about what the United States expects from them or what they can expect from us. So if he's handling foreign policy in a non-military manner, the president is probably acting as our chief diplomat. He can act as the chief diplomat by appointing ambassadors, by signing treaties or entering into executive agreements. And if you want to know what that involves, I would refer you back to the assigned reading for this week's chapter. The final hat of the modern president is that of chief legislator. The president acts as chief legislator anytime he uses his formal or informal powers to exert influence over the lawmaking process by convincing Congress to introduce certain types of policies or to refuse to introduce certain types of policies, by influencing which bills pass and which bills fail, by issuing vetoes, by calling special sessions of Congress, or engaging in agenda setting. Agenda setting is when the president proposes, recommends, or suggests legislation, telling Congress which issues to focus on addressing and what types of solutions to propose. The president can get Congress to comply with his proposed policies or his preferred legislative process by either going public or bargaining. Bargaining is when the president meets with leaders of Congress behind closed doors and they negotiate. Bargaining is advantageous in that it allows the president to cooperate with Congress, getting what he wants without having to alienate them by forcing their hands. But it also requires a great deal of give and take. So if the president isn't interested in compromising, his other alternative is to try going public. Going public is when the president uses his visibility as the leader of our country to speak directly to the American people, mobilizing voters to put pressure on Congress so that they will comply with his preferences. For example, after Barack Obama failed to arrive at a bargain with the United States Congress, getting them to support his proposed Affordable Care Act healthcare reform, he decided to speak directly to the American public. He went on national television and asked everyone to begin writing their senators and House representatives, telling those senators and House representatives that if they did not vote for the Affordable Care Act now, the people would not vote for them in their next election. And because the number one goal of all elected officials is to get reelected, when a massive number of voters start demanding that Congress act in a certain way, Congress usually complies. So going public is a way for the President of the United States to force the hand of Congress if Congress is unwilling to give what he wants them to give without demanding too much in return. So those are the major hats of the president. But how can the president, fulfilling these major roles in our government, be checked by other groups in the government? Well, there are a number of checks and balances that have been built into our Constitution. Most notably, the legislator can check the president by impeaching and convicting him if he commits a certain type of crime. Generally speaking, however, there's a lot of misinformation about the impeachment process and what it means to be impeached, so let's break this down a little bit further. Congress can impeach a president or charge him with an instance of bribery, treason, or some other high crime or misdemeanor. They cannot impeach a president just because they do not like him. That's not authorized by the Constitution. But the Constitution is fairly vague with that high crime or misdemeanor language, so they can usually find some excuse to impeach a president if they would like to do so. The impeachment process takes place in the House, and it involves a simple majority of House members voting to impeach the president. This has happened 3 times in our country's history, most recently with our current president, Donald J. Trump. However, Once the president has been impeached or formally charged with a crime by the House of Representatives, he, like anyone else, gets a trial. The trial takes place in the Senate, and at the end of the trial, the Senate will vote whether to convict the president or to acquit the president. If he is acquitted, the charges are dismissed, and he goes on acting as our president. But if he is convicted, then and only then will the president be removed from office. And this has never actually happened because it's extremely difficult in that it requires a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate, and not just a simple majority, as is the case in the House of Representatives. So 3 presidents have been impeached, but none have been removed from office. And you need to understand that the impeachment process is only really able to be accurately applied in cases where the president has committed a crime. Being unpopular or passing stupid policies is not a constitutional grounds for impeachment, much less for conviction and removal from office. So now that we know about the impeachment and conviction process, let's talk about some of the more common ways in which the legislator can block the president or limit his influence. The legislator can refuse to fund his programs. We saw this with Donald Trump when the Republicans took control of the of the federal House and Senate. They refused to fund the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act. And now that particular bill, that particular policy, the healthcare reform, doesn't really have much chance of long-term sustainability because it lacks a funding mechanism now that the individual mandate has been repealed. Similarly, the President of the United States has been trying to get Congress to authorize funds for him to build a border wall, but they've refused to do so, and thus we have not had a border wall, even though Donald Trump would apparently very, very, very much like for us to get one. They can also refuse to introduce his policies. The president, during his State of the Union and at other times, speaks directly to Congress, telling him what sorts of problems he wants them to address and what sorts of solutions he would like them to consider for those problems. But he doesn't have the ability to introduce any proposals on his own, so he has to depend upon Congress to do it for him. And if Congress refuses to propose a new policy on his behest, well, he's basically out of luck. Similarly, Congress does have the power to to override any vetoes that the president might issue in response to congressional legislation that he doesn't like. Just as the legislative branch can check the president, so too can the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is usually going to check the president by declaring his actions unconstitutional. We'll talk more about that next week, but for now, let's shift our focus and talk a little bit about the presidential imperative. The presidential imperative is the number one priority of all presidents to maintain public support and popularity among the voters. If a president is not popular, it becomes easier for other branches of the government to check him, because the people, not liking the president, are less likely to side with the president against the legislator or against the judiciary in the event that the two come into conflict. Similarly, the president has to worry about his popularity if he wants to get reelected, and if he wants his party to do well in congressional elections or when it's time to select his successor. Democrats tend to do better as presidents and to be more effective as leaders when Democrats control the House and Senate. Republicans, conversely, tend to do better as president when we have a Republican Congress. And what we're going to find is that if a president is unpopular, his party tends to lose seats in Congress, and he tends to be replaced by a candidate from the opposite party, which then opens up an opportunity for that other candidate to gut their legacy. For example, the legacy of Barack Obama was the Affordable Care Act, sweeping health care reform. But after Donald Trump got elected, he and his party took control of the Congress and used that newfound position of authority to kill substantial portions and important pieces of the Affordable Care Act statutes. So the president needs to maintain popularity if he wants to be able to effectively check Congress and fight back against these limitations on his authority. Generally speaking, Congress and the judicial branch do defer to the president, but when he really, really aggravates them, they'll stand up. And in most cases, they're going to win because the president has to back down. So now we've talked about the presidency, and we can shift our focus to the bureaucracy. Remember that the bureaucracy is the body of 2.7 million federal employees who provide the bread and butter day-to-day governance of our country. These individuals are, generally speaking, going to be experts. They're going to be professionals who are hired based on merit rather than elected based on popularity or appointed based on their favorability with certain people in positions of power. So the executive bureaucracy is the administrative machinery of government, and it provides us with two things. Number one, it provides us with foot soldiers. Congress doesn't have the manpower to implement a tax on the ground level, but the executive bureaucracy does. The Treasury Department, for example, has about 95,000 employees, and a very large number of these 95,000 employees work in the IRS. The fact that there are so many of them makes it much more feasible for them to go around gathering everybody's taxes. However, with that being said, it is also important to understand that many of the individuals hired by the Treasury Department are experts who can help to formulate proposed paths forward in terms of our financial systems. Similarly, we have a department which is going to be the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Your typical elected official doesn't really know all that much about urban development, so they're going to rely on experts hired by this particular department in order to know how they can best address problems with our urban development and our highly populated centers. So again, we've got 15 departments within this broader category of the executive bureaucracy, and within those departments we have a variety of subsidiary agencies that handle more specialized tasks. But we also have a whole host of what we call independent agencies. And independent agencies are basically small, specialized government bureaucratic institutions which focus on a very narrow issue area, but which do not have to answer to any particular cabinet or cabinet department. There are two types of independent agency that we need to talk about: the executive independent agency and the independent regulatory agency. The independent executive agency is an agency that reports directly to the President of the United States rather than to a cabinet department or to Congress. And the best example of this is the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA is responsible, again, for implementing and carrying out policies in the realm of environmental regulation. And without them, we would have a much harder time doing things like preventing the various industrial centers in our country from dumping a whole bunch of waste into the rivers we use for drinking water in other parts of our country. But aside from these independent executive agencies that report directly to the president, we also have independent regulatory agencies which don't have to report to anybody. These are usually called commissions, and the reason that they are left completely independent is that they tend to focus on very, very complicated or technologically challenging issue areas like broadcast technology, as is the case for the FCC or Federal Communications Commission. And because these issue areas are so complicated, Congress doesn't feel competent in its ability to adequately address them, and therefore it creates statutes which authorize the engenderment of these regulatory agencies and give them free rein over how they govern their particular policy area. The modern executive bureaucracy has come to fulfill three major roles. The first and most traditional of these three major roles is the implementation of statutory law. Remember from prior lecture that statutory laws are laws created by Congress. And remember from earlier in this particular PowerPoint that Congress doesn't have the manpower necessary to carry out its own laws on the ground level. For that, it is going to depend on the executive bureaucracy. So if Congress creates a new tax, Congress is going to call the IRS and ask the IRS to use its massive number of individual employees to begin gathering all of the information they need to gather that revenue, and then to collect the revenue and send it to the right place. In addition to implementing statutory laws, however, the executive bureaucracy is also expected to make and enforce administrative laws. If a statutory law is a law made by Congress and a constitutional law is a law made by the Constitution, then an administrative law is a law made by an executive bureaucratic agency. Administrative laws come from unelected bureaucracies and are sometimes referred to as regulations. The three primary functions of the executive bureaucracy are to implement statutory laws, to make and enforce administrative laws, and to engage in administrative adjudication. To implement the statutory laws of our country means that the bureaucracy carries into effect all of the policies created by Congress. A statute is a law created by Congress. So statutory laws are the body of all statutes, or congressionally engendered legal policies for our country. Senators and the president don't deliver the mail. House representatives don't count ballots. All of that's going to be done by the executive bureaucracy, which again employs a very large number of people and can afford to put boots on the ground. So they do help to implement, to execute, and enforce statutory laws. But in addition to that, over time, the executive bureaucracy has assumed two other responsibilities that were not originally expected to fall within this particular portion of our federal government. The second major function of the modern executive bureaucracy is to make and enforce administrative laws. Administrative laws are laws made not by Congress or the Constitution, but by the bureaucracy. Now, you're going to remember from the very beginning of this lecture, from earlier lectures, and from your readings of the Constitution, that, of course, the executive branch is not supposed to be creating laws, and there therefore shouldn't be any administrative laws to enforce, and they definitely ought not be allowed to make them if we're in a strictly constitutional system of government, right? Well, maybe. That's an argument, and there may be a lot of merit to that. But Congress has basically created a series of acts, a series of statutes, which create bureaucracies and authorize those bureaucracies to create administrative laws within a realm of delegated authority. So, for example, under the presidency of Richard Nixon, our rivers became so polluted that some of them were literally catching on fire. And faced with this crisis, Congress was unable to act because it didn't feel competent in its ability to understand the intricacies of pollution, ecosystems, and river fires. So, failing to act created a bit of a problem, and therefore, to prevent future situations of that nature, Congress authored a bill which was passed, signed by President Nixon, and created the EPA, authorizing the EPA to create environmental regulations on Congress's behalf. The EPA is only allowed to make laws that pertain to its core mission, as authorized by Congress. And if it were to go outside of those parameters, it will have broken the law. So, because Congress has authorized the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to make environmental policies on Congress's behalf, it is able to do so. But it cannot create rules and regulations about how we communicate using broadcast technology. Those rules and regulations are delegated by Congress to the FCC, or Federal Election Commission. The third and final of the three main functions of the modern executive bureaucracy is to engage in administrative adjudication. Now, administrative adjudication is when the executive bureaucracy engages in adjudication over administrative laws. Remember from prior discussion that to adjudicate is to resolve disputes about how to interpret and apply the law to particular cases or controversies. So, for example, if you were to find that an executive order signed by President Donald Trump violated your constitutional rights, or in your mind some other constitutional principle, you could challenge the president on the grounds that his actions were unconstitutional. Now, the president would, of course, disagree. If he thought his actions were unconstitutional, he probably would not have done them to begin with. So now we have a dispute about the law. Is the president's action constitutional or not? Well, you wouldn't want to take that dispute to the president because you already know how he is going to rule. He's going to rule in his own favor. So instead, you take that dispute about the law to an independent court, to the judicial branch, and the judicial branch will adjudicate. That's not the way things work when you have a dispute about administrative law. Instead of taking disputes about administrative law to a neutral third party or an independent court, you take that dispute to whatever agency created the law. So, for example, if you had a dispute about a policy created by the Environmental Protection Agency, if the EPA engendered a regulation that you felt violated your constitutional right, you would not take that to the United States Supreme Court, you would take that to the EPA. And the EPA will have an administrative tribunal that will review your complaint, and it will decide whether it has, in fact, violated your rights. Now, of course, it's very, very rare for an executive bureaucratic agency to rule against itself, and so some alarm bells ought to be ringing in the back of your head, because there are a few reasons why many people are very concerned with the modern executive bureaucracy. Now, I hope at this point you see that the executive bureaucracy is a valuable resource, and arguably that it's necessary for government, because without the bureaucracy, we wouldn't have experts to help Congress figure out how to interpret and apply its laws, and we wouldn't have enough people to put boots on the ground. Congress might say that we're going to deliver food stamps to hungry families so that children aren't starving in the streets, but it's the bureaucracy that actually ensures those food stamps get where they're supposed to go. So maybe it is necessary, but that doesn't mean it's not controversial, and that doesn't mean there aren't any causes of concern. So let's talk about some of the reasons why the growth of the bureaucracy and the fact that the bureaucracy today engages not just in the implementation of statutory law, but the creation of administrative laws and the engagement in administrative adjudication might be problematic. The first major problem with the bureaucracy, according to many critics, is that it seems to violate the constitutional principle of separated powers. Remember, this constitutional principle tells us that the three core functions of government, creating the law, administrating the law, and adjudicating the law, ought never be concentrated into the hands of any one portion of the government. And yet what we're going to discover, and what we already covered on the last slide, is that all three of these core functions are going to be exercised and implemented by the executive bureaucracy. So the powers to create, enforce, and adjudicate the law aren't any longer actually separated because they have been concentrated into the hands of the executive bureaucracy. And of course, that means that the executive bureaucracy is also inconsistent with the constitutional principle of checks and balances. Because remember, checks and balances tells us that when we are separating the core powers of government across branches, we should give each branch some tool to check the other branches so that no one branch comes over and takes away the core function of another branch. For example, if the President of the United States attempts to begin creating the law, Congress can override him by refusing to fund his projects or by vetoing his legislation. If he starts trying to adjudicate the law, well, the judicial branch can rule his actions unconstitutional. We have a system of checks and balances that is only possible because we have first separated powers. Since all of the powers of government are concentrated in the bureaucracy, there isn't a clear system of checks and balances. You might be able to challenge an act of Congress or an executive order signed by the president by taking it to an independent judiciary, but you can't do that with a policy created by the EPA. You go to the EPA to adjudicate disputes about the actions of the EPA, and of course the EPA is not going to rule in your favor against its own interests. So these are some pretty big concerns, but we're not done yet. There are some other core constitutional principles that are challenged by the modern executive bureaucracy. The next major concern with the modern executive bureaucracy is that it's not entirely consistent with our constitutional principles of democratic governance and the social contract. See, the executive bureaucracy is actually going to make most of the laws that we live under. For every law made by Congress in 2016, we had about 37 laws created by executive bureaucratic agencies. Now, many of these laws were relatively minor and very particular, but that still means that the vast majority of rules and regulations that we have to follow are created not by our elected officials, but by a body of unelected bureaucrats who we can't name or identify. And remember that the concept of the social contract tells us that our government should be based on the consent of the governed. Well, how do we express or withdraw consent? We do so by participating in elections. If you don't want to be governed by Republicans, you can vote them out of office. If you don't want to be governed by Democrats, you can vote them out of office. If you would like to consent to the leadership of Donald Trump, well, vote for Donald Trump. But if you don't want to support him, vote against him. You can express or withdraw consent in Congress and in the executive branch, but you most certainly cannot vote a bureaucrat out of office. And even if we had the power to vote bureaucrats out of office, we can't really hold them accountable because the bureaucracy is so big and Byzantine, so esoteric or hard to understand, that most of us aren't able to identify which agencies are in charge of which parts of federal administrative law. So which policies fall under the domain of the EPA versus the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Energy? which issue areas are going to belong to the Department of Labor versus the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's very, very difficult for most of us to figure that out. And since we don't know which agencies are responsible for which regulations, we can't hold them accountable when they create regulations which are detrimental to our country's well-being or which are corrupt and designed not to benefit the general public, not to create government for the people, but to benefit a handful of special interests. So the modern bureaucracy does seem to raise some questions about our status as a democracy, because again, in a democracy, the people get to choose which laws we live under, directly or indirectly through our representatives. But that's not the way things are working in practice anymore. That's the way that things were supposed to work when the Constitution was written, but the reality of modern America is a far cry from what the framers expected. And that brings us to the next concern. The principle of limited government embodied in our Constitution is also challenged by the bureaucracy. Now, remember from prior lecture that when we say that we have a principle of limited government in our Constitution, we believe that the government ought to be limited in a number of different ways. So, for one thing, it ought to be limited in its overall size, because if it gets too big, then it will be too hard for us to figure out who's making which decisions so that we can reward good decision makers and hold bad decision makers accountable by voting them out of office. Well, that's not the way things are working, clearly, because again, the executive bureaucracy today is the largest employer, not just in the world, but in the history of human existence. Not even counting our military personnel, who technically fall under the executive branch as well, we've got about 2.7 million employees in the federal bureaucracy alone, and that doesn't even count the countless number of individuals in state bureaucracies. Compare that to where we were when the country was originally founded. When our country was first founded under the Constitution of the United States, the executive bureaucracy had 3 departments: the Department of War, now the Department of Defense, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of State. These 3 departments had a cumulative 50 employees, and they basically handled clerical work on a day-to-day basis. We've gone from 3 departments and 50 employees to more than 15 departments if we're counting independent agencies, and about 2.7 million employees. So that's not government limited in its size or scope. It's also not limited in its overall level of activity, because our executive bureaucracy has created the largest body of laws in human history, again creating about 37 new laws for every individual law created by Congress in the year 2016 alone. Now remember that the framers created a legislative process that makes it very hard for Congress to get laws passed. And they did this again because they wanted to limit government not just in its size and power, but in its overall level of activity, understanding that too many laws eventually become onerous and make it very difficult for us to live freely. Well, those steps, those procedures, those checks and balances that weed out all but the very best laws don't apply in the executive bureaucracy. So they basically make whatever laws they deem appropriate without any accountability or any limits on their overall level of activity. And that's perhaps a problem. But the most common concern articulated in the public arena when it comes to the bureaucracy has to do with government spending. Because what we're going to find is that bureaucratic agencies and departments are extremely expensive, in that those 2.7 million employees have to be paid. And we have to cover their benefits, their health care, their retirement plans, their dental, the health care and benefits of their dependents, so on and so forth. All of that's going to cost a great deal of money. And those agencies need resources to fulfill their missions. Now, that might be something simple like stationery, office supplies, printers, and computers, or it might be something rather substantial like a new facility or the equipment to build roads and construct buildings and so on and so forth. All of it costs money, and all of that money is raised through taxation, which means that we, the American people, are paying for it. And today what we're going to find is that for every $100 in goods and services that our economy produces every year, more than a third, nearly 40 out of $100, is going to be spent by the federal government to fuel the growth and activity of our executive bureaucracy. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this too disappointed or upset or alarmed, because again, do keep in mind that the bureaucracy does provide a lot of services which are arguably quite valuable. About 60% of the money that the federal government is spending goes not to things like military affairs, but to what we sometimes refer to as entitlement programs. Now, the term entitlement sometimes has negative connotations, but the idea here is that people are entitled to a basic standard of living, and that it's the government's job to operate through the bureaucracy to ensure that that standard is being satisfied. So, for example, we have food stamps programs that are there to make sure children aren't starving, and that's going to be processed by the bureaucracy. So some of that money is going to things like feeding hungry children, and that's probably a worthy cause that most Americans are probably willing to pay a little extra in taxes to provide. Again, about 60%. 6 out of every $10 spent by the federal government is going to go to one of the 3 largest entitlement programs: Social Security, Medicaid, or Medicare. And only about 15% of what the federal government spends is actually going to go to military affairs. It's also important to understand that when we talk about that 15% that goes to military affairs, a sizable chunk of it is going to go not to doing things like buying planes and aircraft carriers or dropping bombs, but to providing benefits for our soldiers. No other country in the world provides as generous a benefits package to its men and women in uniform as does the United States. We cover health insurance, we cover retirement, we cover benefits for the dependents of our men and women in uniform, we cover marital counseling, we cover basically everything, and all of that costs money. But even if you sum all of that up, and all of the money we spend on national security, and all of the money we spend paying all of our soldiers and all of the ancillary personnel that help them defend our country, that only makes up about 15%. Most of what we're spending is going to helping the elderly and the needy. And that might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, it's up to you, but I do want you to understand that we're not spending the money arbitrarily, at least in theory, but rather to serve core functions. And some might argue that that falls within the constitutional charge of maintaining the general welfare. I'll let you decide whether you find that argument to be particularly compelling. But this basically brings us to an end in our lecture on the executive branch of government. So if you have any questions, you've got my contact information, and I look forward to seeing you next week.